Good morning to everybody.
Good morning, sir.
Today we will continue from comparative studies, different modes of doing Buddhist studies. We have been discussing so far several ways. Particularly in our last discussion, we looked at what is called conceptual studies, how to do a conceptual study in Buddhism. And I thought conceptual studies are very important, particularly for you, because I can see that most of you must be studying things more related to conceptual studies, particularly the deep study of Buddhist concepts. And then we looked at some examples. So comparative studies are in that sense dealing directly with the concepts or the Dhamma. We can also call those studies doctrinal studies. Okay. And then before that we studied philosophical studies, how to do Buddhist studies philosophically. Today let me look at several other modes of studies. Hopefully I will be trying to complete this part of our discussion today. So the first is comparative studies. Comparative studies involve studying two or several concepts, doctrines, ideas, institutions, organizations, etc., highlighting similarities and differences between or among them. This type of study may be done between different religious traditions, between different schools or traditions within Buddhism itself, within the same tradition, for example, between Dhamma and Vinaya, or between early and later suttas, etc. So, comparative studies is another very important and also very I would say popular branch of Buddhist studies today. Particularly people do comparative studies between different religious traditions. Now say for example Buddhism and Christianity, Buddhism and Hinduism and like that, and Eastern and Western philosophies. So there are many ways of doing, many areas you can do comparative studies. So you can compare to several concepts or several doctrines, several ideas or institutions, organizations. For example, there are some very important studies, Buddhism and Jainism. Now, in a comparative study, for example, someone can do Buddhism and Jainism from the monastic Vinaya point of view, because both Buddhism and Jainism have monastic traditions, and Jainese monastic tradition is considered to be even older than the Buddhist monastic tradition, although their texts are somewhat later. And then if you look at the systematic history, of course it is the Buddhist monastic tradition that has a systematic history in the world religion. So Buddhist monastic tradition is considered to be perhaps the oldest organized monastic tradition. But Jaina tradition of course goes to more antiquity, more ancient times. So you can do a comparative study between Jaina and Buddhist monastic traditions. And also you can do Jaina and Buddhist path of freedom, like emancipation or path of final liberation. So like that within Indian tradition you can do comparative studies. Or you can do comparative studies, Buddhism and Brahmanism, certain Brahmanic ideas. So comparative studies, I mean, there is no limit in the sense within the same tradition you can do comparative studies. Like for example, within the Theravada Buddhist tradition, you can look at the discourses and you can look at the commentaries and sub-commentaries, whether there are certain differences or changes like that. But basically when we do a comparative study, although the word comparative lays emphasis on comparison, actually it is not only comparison, it can be what is called contrast. Contrast means there can be differences. So the similarities and differences. However, whenever you choose to do a comparative study, there must be some similarity, some agreement. Say for example, it is hard to do a comparative study between Buddhism and say economical system or something, because two are two different things, right? There must be certain similarities, but within the certain similarities in the sense commonalities. Like two religious organizations you can comparatively study, but maybe not one religious organization and something called sports club or something. Still there can be similarities between the two. But so basically in a comparative study there must be certain connecting points, similarities. But at the same time we are looking at both similarities and differences. So comparative studies, we should keep in mind not something very easy, because comparative studies require you to have knowledge in two different fields. Now for example, if you study Buddhism and Jainism, now for Buddhism you have to have Pali, Sanskrit and those languages. For Jainism you have to have Ardha Magadhi and Sanskrit, particularly Ardha Magadhi, in which Jaina texts have been written. Now if you know only Buddhism, but if you don't know those languages, then of course it is not very easy to do a comparative study. Now very often what happens is, we have expertise in one area, but we think that we can compare it with something else, some other area, which we do not have that much of a experience. Now for example, I have seen very often, say people like those who study law, and they think that they can study Buddhism and law. But then if you have a degree in law, but if you don't have the sufficient study in Buddhism, then how can you compare the two? Sometimes people who do medicine, they think that they can study the Buddhist concept of medicine. But again the problem is, maybe you know medicine, but do you know Buddhism? You have to have both. Now this aspect is something very important, because very often we have expertise in one, and then we try to do a comparative study in a field where we don't have that much expertise. But then methodologically speaking, that is not very good. We need to have both. Now in fact, today in all universities where they allow you to do comparative studies, they require you to have the expertise in both areas. Now for example, what I did is for my doctorate is comparative study. It involved Buddhism and also Western religion, Christianity and Hinduism. Now in my program I was asked to do languages. Of course then they accepted my qualifications in Pali and Sanskrit, so then I did not have to do Pali and Sanskrit, but I had to study German and French in order to read that literature. So here you see, on the one hand you have to have Eastern languages, on the other hand you have to have Western languages, right? But then if I did not have Pali and Sanskrit, then they would have asked me to study Pali and Sanskrit also. Now sometimes studying languages can take long time. That's why comparative studies are not easy. Suppose you are comparing Buddhism and Christianity, then you will have to study some early Christian languages like Hebrew, sometimes even Aramaic, Greek, Latin. Now these are where the original Bibles are available. Christian literature is available. Now if you cannot read any of those languages, and then if you can read only English, that is very limited. Now in Myanmar, if you want to do that kind of study, even if you don't know English, if you read Bible only in the Burmese translation, that can't be successful. Because you don't get an idea about the original that literature. Same thing like you cannot do a deep study only through the translation of Buddhist texts. Translation can be very good. In the very beginning discussion, textual studies, I talked to you about translations. Now any translation is some type of interpretation. Now for the Tripitaka, we know that we have early Pali Text Society translations done by scholars, and then subsequently those translations have been modified, and more correct and more refined translations are now available. Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi has translated Anguttara Nikaya and Sanyutta Nikaya, Venerable Jnanaponika and Bhikkhu Bodhi Majjhima Nikaya, and like that. So there are more translations. But somebody can in future look at earlier translations and Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations and also produce some even new translations, which means that translations depend on the understanding and interpretation. So if you approach any subject only through translations, that is not very successful. You must be able to. So particularly this is so in comparative studies. In a comparative study, you have to know both the areas. I know one example from Sri Lanka. There is one very learned Roman Catholic father called Aloysius Piris. He is still living and now in 80s. He is very well known scholar in Buddhism. Also he is known scholar in Christianity. Now he said something very interesting. He has written about it when he wanted to do his doctorate. Of course he knew his Christian theology. He wanted to enroll in University of London to study Buddhist mindfulness. And on his way there, he met this another very well-known Roman Catholic Buddhist scholar. He is also a Roman Catholic priest, Etienne Lamotte. He was a Belgian. He is very well known. He has a lot of books on, actually he spent his entire life, you can say, studying Buddhism. So he had met this Professor Etienne Lamotte. And then Etienne Lamotte had asked from Aloysius Piris what he is going to do for his PhD. Then he had said that he is going to study Buddhist concept of sati, mindfulness. Then right away the question he had asked was, how do you compare something that you know with something that you don't know? Because he knows Christianity, but he did not have that much of an understanding on Buddhism. So the question was, how can you compare something you know with something you don't know? So actually he gave up the idea. And then he came back to Sri Lanka and did the PhD purely on Buddhist studies. He gave up the doing comparative studies. Because if he were to do comparative studies, then he has to have a good knowledge in Buddhism. Then only you can understand the two subjects you are doing. Otherwise, one subject you know more, the other subject you have just a very cursory knowledge. So how can you do a comparative study? So comparative studies are not very easy. In that sense, comparative studies require you to know both traditions, or both fields, or both areas, or both or several areas. Okay, that's why I say you can do a comparative study in concepts, doctrines, ideas, institutions, organizations. Institutions is something like Sangha organization, monastic institutions, things like that. Now those are more like historical studies. At the same time, you can do doctrinal, philosophical studies. Now this type of study may be done between different religious traditions, different schools or traditions within Buddhism itself, between, you can say, Theravada and Mahayana, or Theravada and Vajrayana. Now again you can do a comparative study. But say if you are doing a comparative study on Theravada and Vajrayana, then for a doctoral study type, a deep study, you have to know Tibetan language. Unless you know Tibetan, unless you know Sanskrit, how can you study Vajrayana Buddhism? So it is one thing for you to read something in English or something in whatever language you know, but it is not like going into the original literature. Here we are talking about doing MPhil or PhD, a research. I mean, if you are just studying for general degree or something, first degree, we can say that maybe you can just go by the translations. But the moment you go beyond that, and moment you want to do a much deeper study, you have to have that basic knowledge on the languages. So I talked about this when I talked to you at the very beginning of this series of discussion about textual studies. But textual studies become again very important when we come for this. Comparative studies require knowledge of all systems that are compared or contrasted. If the two traditions or studies have their own source languages, now source languages for each tradition, we have source languages. For Theravada, we have Pali, basically Pali language. But then not only Pali language for Theravada, what about the modern languages? Now if we study Theravada, suppose if we study Theravada in Myanmar, we have to know the Myanmar language also. If you study Theravada in Sri Lanka, you have to know the Sinhalese language or Thai language if you do it in Thailand. So modern languages also have developed Theravada tradition. Theravada is not only Pali. Now if you look at the Burmese literature can be going into around up to 1000 years older. There are very old Burmese texts. So in order to understand Burmese Theravada, in addition to Pali, you have to understand the Burmese language and the Burmese text. Same thing with Thailand, same thing with Sri Lanka. Now in Sri Lanka we have Theravada text written in Sinhala language going into more than 1000 years. And the Sinhala language in those texts is not very easy. So you have to really learn the ancient Sinhala textual language. Now same thing with if you want to study Mahayana. Mahayana today basically is Chinese. Started with Chinese. Even up to today, the Chinese text, of course, Japanese would read the Chinese text somewhat differently, and the Koreans would read them somewhat differently, but it's basically the Chinese language. So if you don't know the classical Chinese to read the Buddhist text, it's very difficult. But on the other hand, learning classical Chinese can take several years. I remember I had some of my friends studying Chinese Buddhist tradition and other traditions when we were graduate students. In fact, some of those people would spend 3, 4, 5 years only studying the language, because Chinese classical language is not that easy. So now then your research can take 7, 8, 9, 10 years really. You can't help that, because first you have to master those languages. So reading the text itself with the support of a teacher, reading it and understanding takes such a long time. So each ancient traditions, Pali, Theravada tradition, and then Chinese for the Mahayana tradition, for the classical Mahayana we need to have Sanskrit, like that. And then today scholars have discovered not only these main languages like Kharoshthi, Paishachi, and similar languages. Now a lot of extracts from those languages have been discovered and edited and printed by now. So if you only look at the scene of Buddhist textual field, there are so many textual languages in Buddhism that we don't know. There are more recent texts, I think, published by Vancouver, British Columbia, I think Richard Solomon, I'm not exactly sure the name of that scholar, but there are whole groups of scholars who are working on those fragments, pieces belonging to different languages. So studying Buddhism particularly requires, depending on the area you are studying, lot of linguistic expertise. So the two traditions have their own source languages. The researcher needs to know both languages. Although superficial comparisons are possible, such studies are not valuable but also misleading, because you really don't have the enough expertise to say something definitive. Concepts, issues, institutions studied comparatively have to have some fundamental commonality and equality of status. For example, Dhamma may be compared with Dhamma and Vinaya may be compared with Vinaya, but not vice versa. What I am trying to say there is, actually when we compare comparative study, between the two we study, there must be some kind of commonality. Now you can compare Dhamma with Dhamma, Vinaya with Vinaya. But if you take Dhamma and the Vinaya, not that you can't do Dhamma and the Vinaya together, that's possible. But the concepts usually have to have certain commonality, right? Otherwise, there can be differences. I mean, it's natural that there are differences. So there must be certain. Now, for example, you can make a comparative study, Buddhist concept of nirvana and Jaina concept of emancipation, right? Because then both are the ultimate goals of the religious life. And you can't compare nirvana, Buddhist ultimate religious goal, with something less than that. Because then, there is a methodological difficulty. So, concepts, issues, even institutions, you can compare Sangha with Sangha. Not Sangha with lay groups of people or laity, but Buddhist laity with Jaina laity. So there must be some commonality in the subjects or equality of status. Now, Dhamma may be compared with Dhamma, Vinaya may be compared with Vinaya. I say, but not vice versa. I mean, you can't compare Dhamma with Vinaya or Vinaya with Dhamma. But that doesn't mean that you cannot combine Dhamma and the Vinaya and do a study. You can always do. But in the comparative study, what you compare has to have certain commonality. Now, if you study comparatively one leading Buddhist disciple with another disciple of another religion, that disciple of the other religion also have to be on the equal, similar status. You understand? So, basically there must be some commonality of the thing that you are, choosing for the study. An example of this category is the study by Asanga Tilakaratna, Nirvana and Ineffability, in which the concept of ineffability is studied within Buddhism, Christianity and Hindu philosophy. So in my own work, actually what I did was I studied the concept of ineffability. Now the concept of ineffability means the idea that there are certain things that you cannot say in language. The idea that there are certain things that you cannot express in language or communicate in language. So concept of ineffability. And I was looking at this concept in Buddhism, Christianity and Hindu philosophy. It requires you to know some knowledge about all these things. Maybe you don't have to have degrees on everything, but of course you have to have sufficient knowledge. Now in many universities, what they do is they ask you to take courses in these things if you don't have a background. Sometimes there are, I know in American universities there are courses, programs combining, say for example, law and philosophy. So a person with a philosophy degree can study first law and then do a comparative study. But before going to do that, if you have a philosophy degree, then they ask you to take a degree in law, which means that another 3, 4, 5 years you are studying law, and then only you can do a comparative study. So the PhD can take 6, 7, 8 years or something. Or if you have a law degree, then they ask you to do a philosophy degree. And then when you have both, then you can choose a subject of comparative study. So what it means is actually comparative studies are, although it could look like easy, but they require a lot of source language knowledge and also the knowledge across different traditions. Okay, so the comparative studies basically theoretically involve many challenges. Okay, we will before we will move into historical studies. Do you have any questions about comparative studies? If you plan to do any comparative study, the issues involved in comparative studies are very important. So we can spend a couple of minutes if you have any questions about comparative studies. Oh, wonderful, yes.
Actually, I have 2 questions. One is not even, I did not see the question, just confirmation. And also this question is not directly related with comparative study, but related with comparative study of religions.
Okay.
What I have heard is that nowadays, worldwide, university students and teachers and students are not using the word comparative study of religion just to avoid conflicts and confrontations. Conflict and confrontations. Instead of using comparative study of religions, they prefer to use understanding of religions or religions. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes. The question is about the understanding of religions rather than comparative study of religion. In fact, understanding of religion now, such courses are very popular in a lot of universities. Now they are basically not comparative studies. They are giving some kind of understanding about different religions. But when you give us some kind of understanding of different religions, naturally some sort of comparison and contrast, while you are doing that, you can do it. But comparative study as a field still is the challenging area, and it does exist in the university system, Reverend, because you can really go into comparative studies. But only thing is, comparative study requires, as I try to explain, different methods. So the methodology we require is really challenging. So therefore, universities will not be really encouraging people that much to go to comparative studies unless you have that expertise. Now, people think sometimes that with a very superficial knowledge you can do comparative studies. Now, good universities tend to discourage that. So that is why the whole theme of comparative study is theoretically challenging. I remember reading something written by a scholar some time ago, comparative religion, comparing what? Because the moment you say you compare, you accept some kind of similarity. But if there are very important differences, it becomes a challenge. So the difference between comparative study of religion and understanding religions is, in a comparative study of religion, you go beyond understanding religion and you try to understand in each concept in their own context and put together. But basically we start with understanding of religion. But I don't think that means that you are the comparative studies are not done or anything. Comparative studies are becoming or the people who do comparative studies are becoming more and more aware of the challenges and difficulties. Now there was a point, comparative studies were very popular. Everybody thought that they can do comparative studies simply, you know something and read about something and you do. But today that practice is discouraged. So basically a lot of universities have basic courses on understanding religion, and then we go to the world religions, and then I myself have taught that course when I was studying in United States, and we do little bit of a comparison, because it is natural. Whenever you talk about different types of religions, you do little bit. Say for example, now very ordinary thing, like you talk about the pilgrimages in religions. Like the Buddhists have pilgrimages, Christians have pilgrimages, Islam people have pilgrimages. So pilgrimage is a common thing. Now when we talk about it, then we naturally talk about Buddhist, Christian, and there is a little bit of comparison and contrast going on. But real comparative study goes beyond that. Yeah.
Next
Yeah.
question is, you said that when we want to compare, we have to understand both.
Yes.
That's and I also agree
Mm-hmm.
very much. And also you said that suppose if we want to compare Buddhism with the Jainism,
Mm-hmm.
we already have a knowledge of Buddhism.
Right.
And as far as Jainism is concerned, we have to understand the original language of Jainism,
Yeah.
which is the Ada Magadi
Mm-hmm.
or Sanskrit.
Yeah.
That's what you said. See, this word Ada Magadi, I heard even when I was young. This Ada Magadi.
Mm-hmm.
Ada means half.
Ah, yeah.
Half Magadi means, what is it, the other half? and I was not knowing so far.
Mm-hmm.
So far. And also, this Ada Magadi, what does Ada Magadi means? And is it same with Marathi language? That's what I wonder.
This linguistic, the situation is challenging. Normally we use the term Ardha Magadhi. Then the Pali is considered to be the Magadhi. But the actual situation is, there are a number of what is called middle Indic languages. Now, early Indic language means basically Sanskrit. Now, even in Sanskrit, early Indic language, there is even the earlier one, which is Veda. And then we have Sanskrit. Now, as against Sanskrit, scholars use the term Middle Indic languages. Now, Middle Indic languages are all these languages called Magadhi, Ardha Magadhi, Paishachi, and different names. Actually, your question is interesting, because when you say Ardha Magadhi, it means half Magadhi. But I am not exactly sure, but my idea is that it is a kind of Magadhi. It is a half or not complete or something. But the actual scene was when it comes to languages, we see that all these Middle Indic languages there are many different dialects. Now, Jaina texts are available basically in one dialect. Now, Pali is also considered to be a Middle Indic language, so it's another kind of Magadhi. So there are all these different Magadhis. Actually, when they call Ardha Magadhi, I really don't know why they call it Ardha Magadhi, but my sense is that it's not what's it called. We don't know really what the Magadhi means. We know that it was the meaning of the term is that the Magadha language used in the Magadha area. But what kind of Magadhis, we don't know. Even Pali, we call it, in the tradition, we call it Magadhi. But then what we have today as Pali, we are using is actually the language that has been evolved for a long time. Now if you look at the Tripitaka and then you read Visuddhimagga, you can see Pali has changed quite a lot. In the discourses, in a way you can say Pali is much easier than Visuddhimagga, right? Because Visuddhimagga is more Sanskritized version. So Pali itself, even though it is a Magadhi, it has changed. So therefore this the Jaina Ardhamagadhi is one type of Prakruta. Two terms are really Sanskruta and Prakruta. So when you say Sanskruta and then the other is Prakruta. Prakruta means original. Prakruta. It comes from Prakruti. Prakruta, original. That means basic. Sanskruta means Sanskru. Sanskru. Kru is the root. Sanskru means modified, amended, corrected, constructed. Actually, Sanskrit is really a modified language. In the Indian history, we know Panini, who made rules and regulations for this language and make it kind of unchangeable. Because that was the purpose of the Brahmins, because they wanted their religious literature to be in unchanging language. So they really made this Sanskrit. But in Sanskrit is considered to be early Indic language. Prakrits are middle Indic languages. So the early Indic languages are basically Vedic Sanskrit and Sanskrit, two forms of Sanskrit. And the middle Indic languages in that category include both Buddhist Pali and Jaina Ardhamagadhi. And there is later literature written in Sanskrit on Jainism. So actually basic knowledge on Jaina texts you can get from both Ardhamagadhi and yeah. But there are different types of Magadhi, and there is a poet called Setubandha. That's again in one type of Prakruta. So there are different types of Prakruta available in the text. So Jaina is only one Prakruta. But again, to answer your question, Ardhamagadhi, I'm not exactly sure why it was called Ardhamagadhi, but I think the meaning is that it is not a full-fledged Magadhi. But then we don't know what the full Magadhi is anyway, because we don't have evidence today. Now if you look at Ashoka inscriptions, that also is something close to, there are certain inscriptions very close to Pali in certain areas. But in Ashoka inscriptions are all over the country, so they are different from each other depending on those areas. So there must have been many different Prakrit types in India. Even today there are several hundred languages with this all communication and everything. But imagine a situation 2000 years ago, every 100 miles there may have been a different dialect, because people don't move into from their area to other areas unless there is a very special reason. Only the merchants and the people, very few people went from one area to the other. So this is what it is. So language is a very complicated issue when it comes to Indian studies. But Ardhamagadhi, Chinese literature is basically available in that language. That of course there are facilities to learn that language, but not as much as facilities to learn Pali, but still there are facilities to learn. Yeah. So language issue is something very important, because if you go into comparative studies, you really have to you must be ready to spend some time on studying the languages. Okay, so we will move from comparative studies to historical studies. Basically, when we talk about the historical studies, again you must have seen there are lots of books written on Burmese history of Buddhism, and then Sri Lankan history of Buddhism, Indian history of Buddhism, history of, say, if you take Buddhist studies, different aspects of history form a very important part of Buddhist studies. Okay, now we can study the history of the Sangha, history of the Sangha organization, and we can study the history in general in the country, history in certain periods. So history has been a very important field of Buddhist studies. I know about if you take Sri Lankan Buddhist history, there are at least about 10 scholars who have done different periods of Sri Lankan history of Buddhism for their doctorates. So those studies are available. One of the very early studies, E.W. Adhikaram, he did this study University of London in 1940s, very old study. Actually he studied the history of Sri Lanka Buddhism based on the commentaries. And then after that, Venerable Walpola Rahula. And like that, there's a whole series of scholars who studied from beginning up to the modern period the Buddhist history in Sri Lanka. I don't know about the Burmese historical studies, but there must be that type of, somebody can do that type of studies. So the Buddhism in the Bagan period, Buddhism in this period, that period, Buddhism, introduction of Buddhism, the pre-modern history, modern history. So in different areas, different time periods you can study. Basically when we talk about history, we are talking about also the history, and historiography means the method of studying history. How are you going to study the history? Now historiography is also very important subject as a subject itself, but it shows you how to study history. Now basically, what are the historical evidence? Now for example, today, although we have written text, historians would prefer to have inscriptions or that type of evidence, because written text are, although we say written text are early, but if you take the copy of the written text, it's always maximum 200-300 years old. But we have a copy 200-300 years old maximum, which says that it was written about say 2000 years ago. But if you take the text itself, available text, evidence is very modern in the sense maybe the book was copied 100 years ago. But then if you have an inscription, the difference is inscription, if it was written in the Bagan period, it was written in the Bagan period because it is inscribed, right? So the text is old, but it is not like a palm leaf text. Palm leaf text don't last that long, so therefore they get destroyed. So the oldest palm leaf text are, more than something like 300-400 years old and not more than that. Now historiography is studying the problems of this kind. When we study history, what is the proper method of studying history? What constitutes the proper evidence of history? Because history is in a sense very subjective area. Subjective in the sense, how do you want to interpret it? Particularly when you don't have hard facts about history. We basically create a story out of that. Now for example, in Sri Lanka, unlike many Buddhist countries, we have the book called Mahavansa. Mahavansa starts from the very beginning of the Buddha's enlightenment. Even before that, Buddha's practicing paramitas. And then subsequently it records the history of Sri Lanka, history of Sri Lanka Buddhism. But when you look at Mahavansa, you can see that although it is history of Buddhism in Sri Lanka, it talks basically about kings, but it also talks about what the kings did, not only to Buddhism, what the kings did to the people, what the kings did to the economy, how they built water tanks for agriculture. So there is some social history in Mahavansa. But basically Mahavansa was written by a Buddhist monk. It gives main emphasis to what the rulers did for Buddhism, how Buddhism existed. So although Mahavansa is in a sense the history of Sri Lanka, Mahavansa is also the history of Buddhism, and it was written by a Buddhist monk. Now, when a Buddhist monk writes something, we have to assume that Buddhist monk sees something important to be related to Buddhism, not to anything else very much. Now, in that sense, Mahavansa may not be a properly historical book in today's sense. But that is what we have from the ancient times. It has been continued, it has been written up to the modern period by different people. But then sometimes, historical academics, scholars do not like to accept what is said in the Mahavansa if it is not supported by any other independent evidence. Now, for us, we respect Mahavansa so much, so whatever the Mahavansa says, we take to be true. But on the other hand, can it be constructed story? Is it really true? Is it the record of something that really happened that way? So historians ask questions. Now, in the historiography means analysis of this kind about how to do a historical study. What constitute to be the proper historical evidence? So history and historiography are again, interconnected, very important thing. So not only you just study history, but you must be aware of when you are studying history, what do you really study? Because history can be many different interpretations of many different people. History can also be the point of view. Now many scholars say that Mahavansa was written by a Buddhist monk. So then can he be completely be objective, or is he basically presenting the Buddhist monastic view? Now if it is the Buddhist monastic view, it is not a complete history, right? So we have to be in a way careful in using for example Mahavansa as a historical source. But then scholars prefer to have more independent evidence, like they prefer to have inscriptions or other evidence. But otherwise what happens is you have the same story copied or repeated according to one particular book. So historical studies are very important, but at the same time we have to remember that historical studies are methodologically full of problems. Full of problems means how to get the real history. I mean, there is something called real history. Now in the Mahavansa, if you read carefully, at the end of every chapter, Mahavansa says, even if the kings did this kind of things, but these kings finally died and everything is impermanent. Now end of every chapter in the Mahavansa, you go and look at it, you have this statement. Why do we have to make this statement that all the kings died? Because in each chapter you describe the kings and what they did. And then conclusion is that all these kings died and things are impermanent. The idea is, of course, Mahavansa is written by Buddhist monks. Now for Buddhist monks, Rajakatha, Chorakatha are prohibited. Okay? You can't talk about kings and generals and armies and wars and things like that. So you have to have some reason, some excuse. So Mahavansa gives us the impression that he is writing this to show that how things are impermanent, okay, how things are anicca. But actually it is not the reason. It is just because being a Buddhist monk, this author cannot be really talking about kings. But here he is talking about kings, what they did. Also he is talking about the good things they did and also the bad things they did. So how do you really justify your doing that? So in order to justify doing it, in order to show that he is not really doing a Rajakatha, at the end of every chapter you have this statement, things are impermanent, even these kings died. So it becomes Marananusati. Okay, it becomes some kind of meditation. But actually, book is not meant for meditation. Book is meant to give the Mahavansa. Vansa means, the bamboo, interconnected thing. So, connected history of Sri Lanka. So, here you see some historiographical problem. Historiography means the method of studying history. So, in history, people try to develop as much as objective what really happened. But then, it's really the problematic thing whether we can really be completely objective. When I am discussing with you sociological studies, I will be talking about this aspect more. Now, history and area open for various interpretations. The same phenomenon may be studied from various historical perspectives, such as cultural, economic, etc. A study of the spread of Buddhism, history of Buddhism in different countries, locations come within this study. For example, a series of scholars have studied the history of Buddhism in Sri Lanka, from its beginning to the present, as their doctoral studies, which I mentioned earlier. So, historical studies are basically to the study Buddhism. Now, historical method is to study some phenomenon from a historical perspective, to study some phenomenon as a response to or influenced by the historical circumstances of the time of its origin. Now, there can be a lot of debates. For example, about a particular king or about a particular thing that a king did, you can look at from many different points of view. Now, one thing is from the religious monastic point of view. Another thing is the political point of view. If you take the Burmese history itself, you have great kings. But then these great kings, what they did religiously, what they did politically are two different things. Like if you take a king like Mindong, there is no doubt that he did the 5th Sanghayana and he did many things for the Buddha Sasana. But was King Mindong also a great ruler? What was the economy behind that? And we know that under his son, the Burma country was taken by British, right? Now, do you think that King Mindong is, completely not responsible for it? So this is why, on the one hand, from one perspective, we can look at King Mindong as a Buddhist leader and what who served as Buddhism. But on the other hand, what about the politics? What about the economics? So that you can look at from the economic point of view. You can look at from the social point of view, educational point of view. Like, the history becomes very interesting and challenging. In the more recent history, if you take UNU's regime, and then subsequently you have army regime, and then now there's a different regime. But if you look at UNU's regime, he did the Chatta Sanghayana. He did a lot of things for Buddhism. But then on the other hand, what happened in the other areas? Did he do too much for religion? Did you spend too much money on religion? Now, these are possible perspectives somebody can look at. Right? Okay, on the one hand, religiously you say, oh, he was a great leader. But what about the other perspectives? Maybe not. Now you see, history is a challenging thing. But on the other hand, if you really like UNU as a person, then you can't be objective, right? Because then your account, your research can be very subjective. You want to prove that he is a great political leader. Then that is what you want to prove. But whether actually he was a great political leader in every sense, that's something more general. Okay. Now you see that historical studies in that sense are very difficult really. Because we are trying to say this happened in the history in this manner. But then are we sure that our view alone is the true view? Whether there are many other views. So that is why this historiographically, this subjective and objective perspectives are going to be very, very important. Now, a good example for applying this method to early Buddhist studies is Richard Gombrich. His work, How Buddhism Began, conditioned genesis of Buddhism and what the Buddha taught are exercises in this methodology. Now, I give these two books by Professor Richard Gombrich. One is How Buddhism Began, Conditioned Genesis of Buddhism, and What the Buddha Taught. Not what the Buddha taught, but what the Buddha thought. Now, these two are very important because here we have a historical approach applying to Buddhism. Now, usually when we say the origin of Buddhism, we talk about Buddha renouncing household life and going to a forest and self-mortification for 6 years and meditating and becoming the Buddha. Now, that is one way to look at it. But if you look at historically, we can see it differently. Now, if you look at Richard Gombrich's first book, How Buddhism Began, what he has done is, look at the subtitle, Conditioned Genesis of Buddhism. He uses the concept of Paticcasamuppada. Now, Paticcasamuppada says things arise dependently on conditions, right? Now, what he says is, okay, we apply the same principle to Buddhism to understand how Buddhism arises. If everything arises according to causes and conditions, according to Paticcasamuppada, why not Buddhism? Buddhism must have also arisen according to causes and conditions. So that is what he is trying to do in that book. And there, if you read this book, is very interesting. You can see that he is trying to see how the teaching of the Buddha arose just to eulogize and praise particular institutions, so they may not contain truth. But on the other hand, you can ask the same question about inscriptions. What about the inscriptions? How do we believe that inscriptions are really saying the truth? That also is a problem. But at least in the inscriptions, there is one thing important. Like in a palm leaf book, although Mahavansa may have written in the 5th century, right, almost 1600 years ago, the copy of the Mahavansa we find in the Olaleaf manuscript is maybe more than 200 years, right? So, but inscription is not like that. If inscription was written in that period, that inscription is very old. So at least that is the virtue of having an inscription. So in very often when we have exaggerations and all that, what people try to do is corroborate with some other evidence. So if you find true evidence, now I will give you an example from Sri Lankan history. Now we believe that Venerable Arahant Mahinda and 5 others came to Sri Lanka, brought Buddhism. But that is the Mahavansa story. But interestingly, we have found some material showing that some of the relics of the Venerable Mahinda and that group. And there are some inscriptions belonging to that period. So therefore people accept that as a historical fact. But then of course Mahavansa says that Venerable Arahant Mahinda came through air. But okay, we leave that part, but it is a fact that he came. So that's accepted, because in addition to literary sources, there are some inscriptional. I think this the relic casket was found with some names of some of the groups, some monks of that group. So then that shows that the basic report is correct. So the whole thing is this. Otherwise, when you take away exaggerations, maybe truth is little bit like atom or something, but it is covered with lot of things. So in our ancient historiography, that is why people always look for secondary evidence to support it. So otherwise it's very difficult. I remember one of our archaeologists, now he passed away, he's a very renowned archaeologist in Sri Lanka. He one time said that Buddha didn't come to Sri Lanka. And I remember that all the Buddhists got very upset about it. They were very angry about it. But what he really meant is, historically you cannot prove that Buddha came to Sri Lanka. But then our textual history, the folk history has all these things. Buddha visited these places, and Buddha sat in meditation. We have all these stories. But we don't want to reject those things. But on the other hand, because there is no independent evidence, so it's a difficult issue. Now that is why in a modern historiography, this is a methodological problem. If we are good, pious Buddhist, then we accept the story said in the book as Buddhist. But we are not sure. Actually, on the one hand, we cannot say today that a person cannot go through air. We don't know really. We don't know it, right? We can't say it is impossible. How can we say it is impossible? We can't say it is impossible. But on the other hand, we can't say it is possible also, because we don't see people going around in air today. So we are in a position of, we are not being able to say anything definitively how Buddha came, if at all Buddha came. But at least Venerable Arahant Mahinda in the 3rd century BC, he came to Sri Lanka. It is considered to be a historical thing because there is independent evidence. Okay. So, particularly studying Buddhist history, I think as Buddhist, we need to be treading a middle path. On the one hand, we should not accept everything said in the book. But on the other hand, we must not reject everything simply because there is no any other evidence. So I think we must exercise our own rationality to decide which can be true, which can be not true, which can be exaggeration, and so on. Yeah. Okay, why don't we take a short break before we go into the next one? Okay.